Good morning, everybody. My name is Adam Szyminski. I'm with the CSIS Energy and National Security Program. We're very pleased today to host a presentation from the National Energy Board, the NEB. They'll be discussing Canada's energy future. It's a 2017 version for 2018 and the future. Energy supply and demand projections all the way out to the year 2040. This report, which is part of the NEB's annual Energy Future Series, features long-term projections of Canadian energy supply and demand. The 2017 edition examines how recent energy developments, especially in climate policy, have affected Canada's energy outlook. The study also includes additional scenarios focusing on long-term climate policy and technology trends. Similar in structure to the U.S. Energy Information Administration's annual energy outlook. The report is the only public long-term Canadian energy outlook that includes all energy commodities from all of the provinces and territories in Canada. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody of the safety announcement. If the fire alarm should go off, we're not expecting that. One way out is back here. The stairs are over to this side and down out the front door, or you could go out the back here. And there is a way through the alley to end up at the National Geographic. There's always good exhibits over there. But I think you'll actually enjoy this presentation on Canada more than wandering around out there in the wind and rain this morning. The presentation today, Dr. Abba Borgava, Chris Dolman, and Matthew Hansen is going to be followed by a Q&A session. Let me just very briefly tell you a little bit about Abba, Chris, and Matthew. Abba is the director of the Energy Integration Team at the National Energy Board, and she's responsible for all of the Energy Futures report series. Abba and I have known each other for a long time. When I was at the Energy Information Administration, we had, and even before that, had a lot of interaction with the National Energy Board in Canada and trying to understand the assumptions that our respective agencies were putting into the long-term forecast. Chris Dolman is a market analyst with the Energy Integration Team at the NEB. He's worked on various areas, including end-use demand modeling, the natural gas liquids markets, oil sands efficiency trends, and overall energy supply and demand. Matthew Hansen is also a market analyst in the Energy Integration Team. He's been with the NEB since 2008, specializing in energy demand and electricity modeling. So there are a lot of interesting aspects to Canada. Very large trade partner with the United States, largest energy trading partner with the United States. So it's I think, not just important for the Canadians to understand Canada's energy future, but for the rest of us as well. And we're delighted to have the NEB team here this morning. Thank you very much. Abba, are you going to start off? Sure, you can speak from right there. That'd be, and then you'll be able to see the screen. Let me bring the clicker and keyboard down, and we'll be all set.
Thank you.
I think this should work.
So this is...
That's this side of the star.
Oh, okay, this side of the star. Okay, good. Thank you. Good morning. It's always a pleasure to come out to DC and share our work. So thank you for the opportunity. I must admit, as I was saying to Adam and Sarah, that this was not the most calming trip that we've ever had. We started with mechanical failures to the flight that we were on, and then after that, delayed flights, and eventually got to Toronto Airport at about 1, or Toronto Hotel at about 1 a.m. in the morning. And so there were times where we thought we wouldn't be here. So very pleased to be here, and thank you for being the audience. NEB, the National Energy Board, is a federal agency. It's located in Calgary, about 400 people. And so our main responsibilities are determined by the National Energy Board Act of 1959. And our contribution to the energy development in Canada focuses largely on regulating the construction, the operation of the international and interprovincial pipelines, the international and designated interprovincial power lines, authorizing tolls and tariff, and then also authorizing exports of oil, gas, natural gas liquids, and electricity, and the imports of natural gas. If you compare it to organizations in US, we are a combination of FERC, PHMSA, and the EIA. So that's kind of where we stand with our work. And what we are doing here is from the energy information part of NEB, and our report that we present today is our flagship product. So I'd like to begin with just a very brief context.
It might be easier to just use this.
Just kind of do that. So page down.
Yep.
Page down is this one, right? Yes. Okay. Well, one more. Yeah. So energy is actually big in Canada, and the sector contributes about 10% to the GDP, about 5% to employment, about 35% to the non-residential investment, and 20% to exports, and about 8% to imports. So a very significant part of Canadian economy is the energy sector. And Canada's energy sector is best described by province and territories, largely because it's a very diverse mix, stemming from the indigenous resource of each jurisdiction. And so, for example, natural gas plays a very significant role in Western Canada. It's used a lot more, and largely because much of oil and gas is produced in the Western provinces. Electricity is more significant in hydro producing regions, and if you're familiar, they span all across Canada, starting from Quebec on the east to Manitoba in central Canada, and then to British Columbia on the west coast. For the territories, the three territories, they are situated far north. They're very remote, and the main consumption fuel there is the refined petroleum products. Canada, with it's a large producer and a large consumer of energy. Although we produce significant amount of oil, as this chart really shows that the production of oil by type has been increasing quite significantly. And on a world level, we are the fourth largest producer of oil in the world. But then we are also a significant producer of non-emitting energy, largely hydropower and the renewable electricity. In fact, for hydroelectricity, we are the second largest producer of hydropower in the world, and fourth largest for renewables. Of course, just like our southern neighbor, we are also a huge consumer of energy, second largest on a per capita basis in the world. And this is all driven by our mass geography, very relatively low population, which leads to low population density, harsh climate, and then the energy-intensive industrial structure of the Canadian economy. So moving on to, so here's now, as we all know, North America is blessed with an well-integrated energy market. This chart that we have here is actually drawn from North American Cooperation on Energy Information. And one of the big leaders on this initiative is Adam Szymanski. So a lot of work was done under this organization. And actually, I recall, the stuff that we did under this initiative on outlooks basically suggests that North America is quite self-sufficient on an aggregate basis. So, but there's a significant flow of the three commodities between these three countries. And if you want to just focus on US and Canada, a significant amount of US imports into Canada come from, into US come from Canada. So for example, crude oil, 41% of US imports is coming from Canada, 97% of natural gas imports, and 94% of electricity. And all of this contributes to about 36% of US consumption of crude, 10% of natural gas consumption, and 2% of electricity consumption, all coming from Canada. There's, again, equal flow of energy into Canada from US. And so crude oil, about 54% of Canadian imports come from US, which leads to or contributes to 20% of our consumption. 99% of imports of natural gas come from US, and then electricity is 100%. So really large numbers indicating how important that energy sector and linkages between the two countries are.
Abba,
Yes, please.
folks might want to know that they can go to nacei.org and see all of that information in 3 different languages, English, French, and Spanish. Lots of statistics and other interesting things. So thank you for mentioning that. It was a delight to be able to work with Canada and Mexico on this joint project for North America, and I appreciate you mentioning it, Abba.
So in terms of where we are in Canada on energy, the Canadian sector is evolving at a rapid pace, and largely in response to developments in policy and developments in technology. So we've got a chart here, which we've extracted from Market Snapshot that was done last year, January 2017. And it's an interesting one because between 2015 fall and 2016 December, it shows how much development took place at the international, at the federal, and at the provincial level in Canada on climate policy. So each of these dots actually represents a significant announcement of a climate policy. And the box on the right actually explains or highlights some of the key policy developments that took place in the last few years. On the technology side, I mean, we all know about the shale and all of that, but there's been significant development also in the oil sands. And so robust growth in technologies has led to robust growth in the production of oil despite the low price environment. Also in the renewable front, we find that wind and solar are benefiting from technological progression and the deep cost cuts that this sector has experienced. So basically, a lot is changing, a lot is evolving, and that really brings us to the topic that we are here for, basically looking at the consumption and the production trends. How will they evolve over the next 25, 30 years? So I'd like to pass the presentation to Matthew and to Chris, who can walk through the highlights from the report.
Great. Thanks, Abba. So we'll move on to the Energy Futures Report. We've already sort of talked about what it is, similar to the EIA's Annual Energy Outlook. One thing that's kind of notable is this 2017 report actually marks 50 years of the NEB doing Energy Outlook. So the first one was 1967. Very snappy title called Energy Supply and Demand Forecast, 1965 to 1985. So as you can see, this is a photo of it here. We have one copy in the library. Energy Supply and Demand Forecast, 1965 to 1985 is very big. It's like this thick and, double space font. Very cool cover, as you can see. But one of the things that's really cool when you go back at this report, which was released over 50 years ago now. The themes of energy, environment, technology kind of all intersecting were just as prevalent. And one of the more fun examples is there's 2 pages in that report devoted to explaining why they're not including a lot of electric vehicles in their forecast. So back in 1967, devoted two pages to explaining why that wasn't in the 20-year outlook. But on to Canada's Energy Future 2017. So 50 years later, here was last year's report. So generally follows the usual format of a baseline reference case projection, as well as some scenarios or sensitivities covering some key uncertainties for Canadian energy. Recent reports that we've done have included scenarios on prices, pipelines, pipeline export capacity, potential LNG export volumes. And this report takes a bit of a different focus, focusing on uncertainties related to long-term climate policy developments and technological trends. And some of the elements that Abba just spoke about are really what's driving that focus. Some of the rapid recent progress in both of those areas have been some of the key factors in energy over the last couple of years. So we've devoted a couple scenarios to them. So I'll spend a bit of time here kind of explaining the structure of the report and the 3 scenarios shown here, which we undertook for EF 2017. So the first thing to mention is that unlike, say, if you're used to like a high price and a low price case, which kind of form a range around a baseline, these 3 scenarios really kind of build off each other, kind of asking additional like, well, what if this happens, and what if, okay, that happens, but then what if this happens too? So we have a reference case baseline which attempts to provide a consensus view on prices and economic growth and includes currently announced policies where there's at least enough detail announced to model them. One of those announced policies that we've included for the first time is what's called the Pan-Canadian approach to pricing carbon pollution. Now, this initiative isn't one national single price on carbon, but it allows provinces and territories to choose how they would like to implement a carbon pricing system and certain benchmarks they need to hit. For example, if a province wanted to implement an explicit price-based system, such as a carbon tax, there's kind of a minimum price set starting at $10 per ton in 2018, rising $10 each year, and it's defined until 2022 when that $10 per year hits $50. Provinces can also do a cap and trade system or like a hybrid approach as well in that overall framework. That's a very high-level overview. There's lots of details, and not all provinces have declared their intentions, so there is some uncertainty. For our analysis in that reference case baseline as a simplifying assumption, and it is a big simplifying assumption, we said that the carbon price across the country basically is $50 per ton after 2022 in nominal terms for both provinces with an explicit price-based system or a cap and trade. And since there's nothing defined beyond 2022, we've left that flat in nominal terms. So it actually declines a bit when you adjust for inflation. But that being said, there is language in the framework that the policy will be reviewed in 2022. So there's some term uncertainty there. So to address that, we've developed the next case in red there, the higher carbon price case, which assumes that there is increasing global climate action and Canada continues to increase the stringency of our climate policy, and this is sort of demonstrated in this case by a rise in carbon price, increasing about $5 per ton per year out to 2040, which gets you to about $140 per ton by 2040, or about $80 to $90 in 2016 dollars. So our final case, the technology case, builds off that higher carbon pricing case by asking, well, what if there is like significant technology response to these higher carbon prices and greater global climate action? Since the pace and magnitude of technology trends can be pretty uncertain, it's definitely a question worth looking into. So that case assumes the same rising carbon price case, but includes several examples of greater technology adoption, including higher electric vehicle penetration, lower solar and wind generation costs, and reduced emission intensity for oil sands production. So that's kind of the general structure of the scenarios. The other key factor to talk about, in addition to the carbon price, is the crude oil price, especially for a large oil producer like Canada and where it's such an important part of the economy. Because these scenarios progressively assume greater global climate action and technology, it made sense to us that they would also implicitly assume lower global demand for oil and hence a lower global oil price. So again, as an assumption, we're not trying to predict the price of oil here at all with these. We make assumptions about global oil prices. So the long-term assumption in the reference case is $80. We assume it's $5 lower, $75 in the higher carbon price case. And in the technology case with, say, increased EV adoption, things like that, assumes it eventually drops to $65 in that case. So that's the general structure of the report. Before getting into the key results, which I'll pass over to Chris, a few more fine print items that are kind of worth thinking about. First, this is an analysis of supply and demand. So in terms of any questions on future infrastructure, pipelines, market availability, that kind of thing, it generally assumes infrastructure will be built as needed and markets will be found. So it really focuses on that long-term elements. Goals and targets are not modeled explicitly, but policies and regulations that are in place to meet them are. And in terms of policies and programs, we basically included everything that was announced, provided there was enough detail. So we included the pan-Canadian approach to carbon pricing, but there are some other policies which are under development right now, could have a pretty significant impact, such as the clean fuel standard, but there wasn't enough detail at the time we did the analysis to include it. And overall, some of these policy initiatives can be pretty complex, and there is some uncertainty in various aspects. So we've made some simplifying assumptions throughout the analysis.
All right, thanks, Matt. So I'm just going to provide an overview here of the highlights of Energy Future 2017 that we're going to share with you today. First, I'm going to talk about fossil fuels and mainly about how this is how technology, climate policy, and other factors have came together to produce the first Energy Futures reference case scenario, where we have fossil fuels peak in the projection period. And then I'm also going to talk a bit about how higher carbon prices and a few technology penetrations are going to help reduce that even further in the alternative cases. And then Matt's going to start talking about how Canada's electricity mix changes over the forecast. Canada's electricity mix is pretty green right now. About 80% of it is from non-emitting sources, and he's going to talk about how the adoption of more solar and wind helps that increase over the projection period. And then he'll talk about the long-term crude oil and natural gas production increases. The long-term crude oil and natural gas production projections over the forecast period, and then how the higher carbon prices and technology shape as well, and price shape that over the projection period. Now, first, the baseline projection here. So After in the early stages of their projection period, fossil fuels increase until 2019, where they start to plateau for the rest of the projection period. And on this chart here, you're sort of seeing like lines of our last decade worth of reports for fossil fuel projection. And you can sort of see that there's this bending over time, going back from EF 2007 to EF 2017 on the bottom. And so I'm sort of just going to explain here, like, what is bending this projection over the last decade. And the first thing would be energy efficiency. We've had increased improvements in energy efficiency throughout these decade of outlooks in all sectors of the economy. I'll give you a couple examples of ones that were big factors in EF 2017. We had a pretty high penetration of electric vehicles in this report, and that because electric vehicles are about 3.5 times more efficient than gasoline vehicles currently, that's going to just drive efficiency gains in the passenger sector. Also, in the heavy-duty vehicle side of things, this is the first report where we had sort of HDV2 come on post-2018. So you have improved freight efficiency. Moving on to climate policy would be the other major factor. If you look at EF 2007, which is the highest fossil fuel projection that goes out to about 2030, back then you had no area in Canada, no jurisdiction had a price on carbon. You fast forward to EF 2016 update, which is the blue line, the second lowest fossil fuel projection. You had about 80% of the population in a jurisdiction where carbon was being priced. And then EF 2017, we have carbon price throughout the economy after 2023, as well as the price is higher than it was in EF 2016 update. Another thing would be coal phase-outs. Back in EF 2007, I think only Ontario was phasing out coal in that projection period. In EF 2016 update, Alberta had its 2030 coal phase-out integrated into that forecast. And in EF 2017, you have the federal-wide phase-out of coal. And I guess the last thing will just be macroeconomics. EF 2007 in particular is pretty stark. That was done before the the financial crisis. And that had a lasting impact on a lot of industry in Canada, which impacts demand and therefore impacts fossil fuel use. So you had basically what I'm saying here, just GDP growth or gross output growth for a lot of sectors is lower than it was about a decade ago. So, and now I sort of explained why things ratcheted down over time throughout our outlooks. Now just to sort of get into why this outlook is peaking. And to sort of do that, I think it's good to do things on a fuel by fuel basis. So I start with coal in an ironic green color in this chart. You kind of basically, this all comes down to the phase out. You have a federal phase out in 2030. However, in Alberta in particular, there's earlier than needed or earlier than required phase outs happening around 2020. So that starts coal and coal products declining around 2020. And moving on into oil products or refined petroleum products in blue, you have several things coming together. You have vehicle emission standards that are reducing energy demand for gasoline and diesel in the freight and passenger sectors. You have in the non-transport sectors, you have efficiency improvements resulting, well, you have fuel switching away from fossil fuels due to the carbon price, as well as energy efficiency gains, decreasing oil use in that sector. And I'd say lastly, you have electric vehicle penetration reducing gasoline demand in that sector, or in that, for that fuel. As well as, let's not forget biofuel blending. That's going to put a damper on oil product growth throughout the projection period. And lastly, I'll talk about natural gas, the lone fossil fuel that grows over the projection period. It's growing due to natural gas-fired generation and growth in the in-situ oil sands sector. But it's there's a damper put on its growth due to significant improvements in oil sands production methods, as well as energy efficiency improvements in buildings and increased penetration of renewable electricity. And then moving on to the alternative cases, just to get a show for what fossil fuel does in those scenarios. So they also have fossil fuel use peak in 2019. The higher carbon price case has higher carbon prices, disincenting more fuel switching away from fossil fuels to greener fuels, and you have about 8% lower fossil fuel use in that scenario. In the technology case, you have increased the higher carbon prices as well as increased technology penetration. You get about 13% lower than the reference case and 5% lower than the higher carbon price case. And just to get a bit into what technologies are doing what here to reduce fossil fuel demand, with a lower electric battery cost, you're getting a higher EV penetration in that case, which lowers gasoline demand relative to the other cases. We're seeing increased employment of steam solvents, which is improving oil sands in situ energy intensity, which reduces natural gas use in the technology case. Lower wind and solar costs and improved renewable integration are reducing electricity generation from fossil fuels. And lastly, greater electrification of space and water heating in buildings is leading to lower natural gas use in the building sector. And then I'll pass it back to Matt to start talking about electricity.
Thanks, Chris. So that was really kind of the major energy use story. Canada's sort of domestic energy use story was quite a big part of the release when we did the report. Lots of interest, particularly because it was kind of a changing trend, or at least the kind of evolution as we showed all those outlooks for Canada's domestic fossil fuel use have been declining over time, and it finally kind of flattened out. So I'll talk a bit more about the supply side. First on electricity, Canada's electricity generation mix, and then oil and natural gas. So as Chris mentioned earlier, Canada's electricity mix evolves pretty significantly in the projection. The evolution, however, has been kind of happening for a while. So to demonstrate, first we'll look back a few years at Canada's electricity generation mix in 2005. So what are we looking at here? Well, this image shows electricity generation mix. It's from our suite of data visualizations that go along with the report, and I'll talk a bit about those later. But just to explain, each one of the black circles represents a province or territory in Canada. So all 10 provinces and 3 territories. And then the colored dots inside represent the relative generation from different sources. So bigger dots mean more generation, and provinces that generate more electricity have bigger dots and bigger circles. That's sort of the structure here. There's a lot to digest here, so what I'm going to focus on is kind of the overall mix of colors in there. So although, looking at the electricity mix in the northern territories is really interesting, don't try and squint your eyes too much to see what those are. We'll take it pretty high level as a starter. So the first thing you can see here is there's a lot of blue highlighting Abba's earlier point that Canada has a large share of hydro in the mix. Back in 2005, there was also a decent amount of coal generation. So those are represented by the brown dots. There was some gas, which is orange, and some nuclear in yellow, particularly in Ontario. That's the big yellow dot there. So overall, when we look at the 2005 mix, there's a lot of blue, brown, orange, and yellow, or hydro, coal, gas, and nuclear. So let's fast forward 10 years. So 2015, still a lot of blue hydro, still a big yellow nuclear dot in Ontario, a bit more orange for gas, and significantly less brown for coal. In fact, over this period, Ontario phased out its coal generation fleet, which was a pretty big chunk of the total coal capacity. You'll also note that now the green dots start to enter the mix, which represent wind and solar generation. So finally, we'll take a look out over our projection period to 2040 in our reference case. So still a diverse mix, but there's been some significant changes and projected to be some significant changes. So number one, that coal is virtually gone. This highlights, Chris mentioned that we expect a coal phase out for the most part in electricity generation by 2030. So by 2040, it's out of the mix. And the other big change is those green dots are getting bigger and pretty significant by 2040, and that's driven by both policy initiatives and expected cost declines and improved economics, so becoming a bigger choice when you need to add generation to the mix. I'll talk a bit more about data visualizations later, but if you actually check this out on our website, you can kind of like press play and see it evolve through every year and look at the different scenarios, and it's a lot of fun. So if you're interested, check that out. But to focus on a bit more on those green dots, so solar and wind, Abba touched a bit on those earlier. So these are the reference case solar and wind capacity projections. The reference case ones are the solid lines. So in the reference case, wind capacity in Canada more than doubles to 2040, and solar more than triples to 2040 from the current levels. So pretty significant growth, even in the reference case. And then that technology case where we assume lower wind and solar costs, improved variable renewable integration. As you can see, the dashed lines are a lot higher for both solar and wind over the projection period. And by the end of that case, solar and wind make up about a quarter of Canada's electric capacity. So that's the electricity side. Talk a bit about crude oil and natural gas. For crude oil, here are the crude oil price assumptions and the Canadian crude oil production projections. In our baseline at $80 per barrel in terms of price, we assume that's enough to incent quite a bit of increased Canadian oil production, and by 2040, it increases to over 6 million barrels per day in that baseline reference case projection. So in the higher carbon price case, which has that lower oil price, which is a big driver there, production still increases, but at a slower rate. Now, the technology case is an interesting one because we assume that one has the lowest global oil price, but also a greater implementation of technologies in the oil sands that reduce emissions intensity, but they also improve the economics using less natural gas, less water, that kind of thing. The main one there being increased use of steam solvents. So that technological improvement basically allows production to remain at the same level as a higher carbon price case, even though the global oil price is lower. So that's kind of a key dynamic there, that the it's affected by a lot of different things, and prices, markets, technology are all important. The final thing I'll note here is it's a good example of the difference between correlation and causation. You'll see both of these charts have kind of a downturn in basically the first year. So 2016 prices were pretty low. You'll see a dip downwards in 2016 Canadian crude oil production, not really so much driven by prices being low, but more the Fort McMurray wildfires, if you remember that. There were some significant fires that year, and many of the large operations had to shut down. Probably would have been on pace to grow production that year, but you can see what a significant event that was, showing up in the total Canadian crude oil production line there. Now on to natural gas. So for natural gas, we assume prices increase over time, and we don't vary the North American gas price, in this case Henry Hub, across the three cases, because it wasn't obvious to us whether greater global climate action meant higher or lower natural gas prices because of the different demand or supply responses you might imagine. So we left those ones unchanged. Is a difference in the production projections, though. In the reference case, Canadian production declines in the near term due to those lower prices, but in the reference case, eventually begins to increase as prices rise once they get into kind of that $3.50, $4 per MMBTU range. The lower production outlooks for the other cases are largely related to lower oil production in those cases, as the associated or solution gas produced along with oil declines as the production declines. So that's as a whole is the EF 2017 report. Some of the highlights. There's a lot more information out there, and beyond either a electronic report like we have now, or a gigantic report that they had 50 years ago. Data is always a big part of this, as it is with the EIA work. EF is really just more than a report, also a large data source. And over the last few iterations, we've developed a data visualization tool. I showed you some of the electricity images from it that really try and make that data more accessible and interactive for users of the data. So that's been really great. And then beyond energy data, the NEB just released a brand new visualization focused on regulatory data, specifically incidents at NEB-related pipelines and facilities. So this one's a major step forward in how regulatory data is displayed and allows users to see where incidents happen, what type of incidents, and many other parameters in what's really an extremely complex data set. And just closing up here, for the NEB really has a lot more information beyond just the outlooks. So here's a bit of an overview of the Energy Information Program. Of course, the outlooks are a big part. We're working on the next version of Energy Futures, EF 2018, scheduled for release this fall. Recently launched Canada's Pipeline System Portal, which has a ton of info, data, and that kind of thing about the pipeline systems in Canada. Province and territory profiles is another new project that allows you to look at the supply and demand and GHG current data for all the provinces and territories in Canada. A few other reports, and I'll also note our weekly market snapshot series. This is kind of our attempt to do the EIA. Today in energy, we only do one a week, which is a lot of work as well. It's definitely enough work, but it allows us to show some cool things. So this chart here is actually a really cool data set with an interesting result for 2016. So this is annual Canadian wood pellet exports by their destination. So in 2016, Canadian wood pellet exports increased by 56%, largely driven by increased demand from the UK and Japan. So kind of an interesting data series, and that sort of weekly snapshot allows us to highlight those things. So that's it. There's a website where you can check it out, or the NEB's Twitter handles.
Fantastic, Abba, Chris, and Matthew. Really appreciate that. Could you go back to slide 10? And I have a question, and we'll start. And then all of you out there should start thinking about what questions you'd like to do. We've got plenty of time for Q&A. Let's go. Let's see. Ahead one or back one? It's the factors behind peak flattening. I think ahead one.
Okay, so
Slide 11.
Is the next one?
Yeah, slide 11. Right, that one. I'm just eyeballing there. Coal clearly going down the green line. And oil actually doesn't look like it's changing that much between 2015 and 2040, but gas is expanding. And I think you talked about that. Maybe out in Alberta, a lot more, I'm just guessing, in Western Canada, more natural gas being used for electricity generation than coal. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Right. One of I think that's kind of interesting, because the whole idea of peak demand, peak energy demand, peak fossil energy demand, or peak oil demand seems to be very much on everybody's minds, and I thought it would be interesting and somewhere in these other numbers, I think you must have had a total energy number. So you've got total energy consumption still rising in Canada.
Yeah, it's the total energy consumption is rising, although not that much. Oh. Yeah.
There was a really interesting comment, and perhaps in the short run, we're going to forecasting is always dangerous. Long-term forecasts are great, I think, really for looking at deltas against your scenarios. Like, what does the reference case scenario versus the higher carbon price scenario versus a high technology scenario give you, and how do things shift around in the near term? At Davos yesterday, the IMF released a new economic forecast for the world, and part of their statement reads as follows. The U.S. tax reform and associated fiscal stimulus are expected to temporarily raise U.S. growth with favorable demand spillovers for U.S. trading partners, especially Canada and Mexico, during the period out for the next several years, actually. They raised the global economic forecast from 3.7% growth this year and next to 3.9%, which could add a significant number to overall energy consumption around the world and oil consumption. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on how the Canadian economy would respond on the upside to, how energy use in Canada would respond to higher economic growth forecasts.
I think, when Chris was sort of comparing the 2007 forecast to the 2017 forecast, one of the key points there is that in 2007, the economic growth forecast was closer to 3%. I think it was 2.7 or something like that. Whereas now we see it's about 1.6, 1.7%. So obviously economic growth is a key determinant of what the energy demand will be. Actually, when we did this work, this result that we had was quite a trend setting, because for a very long time, and the energy demand has been growing at a much faster rate. So even if we put the peak demand concept on side, I guess the key message is that the energy demand is slowing. And now whether it's going to peak next year, because that's when 2019 is, I think it will depend on a lot of factors. The interplay of, as again Chris was explaining, energy efficiency trends, which seem to really take off in many sectors and many areas, as well as the climate policy that again is having a key impact. So it's like economic growth is a key factor, but then how do the other determinants really play out will actually determine what happens in the future.
So Canada's to be congratulated, Abba, for, I think the IMF said in 2017 that Canada had the highest economic growth of all of the G7 countries. So US, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, the UK. You're doing something right up there. So
Yeah, Adam, I'll add, this is a pretty flat fossil fuel projection forecast. I mean, there are several data points that could be the peak. So I guess if you're having a tad bit higher growth, I mean, I just assume the peak might move out a bit, I guess. All else equal, just looking at that.
The other thing that I noticed, and if you could go to the two slides with the oil and gas price forecast, I think that the oil forecast kind of goes up from where we are now, let's call it $65, dollars a barrel, up to 80, and flattens out after 2025. And now if you go down the slide to gas, gas moves up, similarly between now and 2025, and then, but continues to grow after 2025. Is there, maybe we really are in an age where oil prices and natural gas prices are being set in their own markets and aren't really being driven. That's certainly been the case in the United States, and I think Canada as well. Is the expectation there that because demand for gas is rising as you substitute coal out, that you're going to get higher prices? As that's kind of what is driving that?
Yeah, I think that's a big factor there, and one of the reasons maybe why those are kind of moving in different directions. It's incredibly uncertain, and we kind of make the assumptions as a starting place for both oil and gas prices. But yeah, that's, I think, longer term gas. There's maybe a bit more upside on the demand as opposed to oil when you start thinking about the pretty significant vehicle efficiency improvements that are on the way and things of that nature.
And I have to absolutely agree with you about the uncertainties in all these forecasts. There was an interesting presentation last week at one of the energy economics lunches here in Washington about the possibility that demand for natural gas might be face a lot of competition from battery technology. If battery technology expands the possibility of using renewables better because of the ability to store the electricity might actually compete pretty effectively with gas. So, right.
Yeah, and I think over our outlooks, you see kind of that ratcheting down on fossil fuel use. One of the big things is, even as you had coal retirements, and that's kind of been in several of our outlooks, maybe when we did retiring coal fleet or slowly phasing out as they end their useful lives, it was like always replaced with gas. And more, it's replaced by maybe a combination of gas and renewables. And that's kind of been a trend with these outlooks too.
Well, okay. I'm sure that there are questions out here among our guests this morning. And let's start over here. Thank you. And please tell us who you are and wait for the microphone, which is coming right now.
I have a simple question. I'm Matt Cook with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. You show slight increases in natural gas demand as well as increase in production. It indicated there's about 10% of your supply of natural gas comes from the United States. Do you see that increasing to fill any of that demand, or is it simply going to be made up by growth in production in your country?
Well, we don't have a specific estimate of where the gas is going to go. I mean, certainly we have increasing gas demand and increased gas production. I think production increases a little bit faster in the long term in the baseline. But certainly the integration between Canada and the U.S. Has changed a lot in recent years with shale gas coming on, and that'll kind of continue to evolve. But there's no specific view in this report of the relative, how those markets are being satisfied.
Hi, Jeff Epping with Energis LLC. A couple of questions. With the NAFTA renegotiations, any thoughts on how that might impact the energy economy of Canada and the integration with the U.S.? And then secondly, on natural gas and power, are you assuming in your modeling any carbon capture in storage or utilization?
I'm just going to guess now that Abba, Chris, and Matthew feel a bit on the NAFTA question as I did when I was at EIA, which was one answer away from returning to the private sector. So I might be willing to make a comment there, but Abba.
And I completely agree. But again, I mean, as we all know, NAFTA negotiations are quite high on the radar of both countries, and we, or three countries, and we wish everybody luck in terms of reaching some good outcomes. I mean, again, my own view is that it's been 20 years when NAFTA was first drawn up, so things have changed. Opportunities and challenges what we face now are very different what they were 20 years ago. So hopefully all of that would be included and addressed. Thank you.
Jeff, what was the second part of your question?
Gas, power, any CCUS,
We have nothing for natural gas. We have coal CCS in Saskatchewan. That's
On the NAFTA questions, and rather than dealing with that here, let me just say that Guy Caruso, who's part of the energy team here at CSIS, has been looking very carefully at NAFTA issues from an energy standpoint. So you might want to talk with Guy after the session is over. And online, there have been a number of workshops here at CSIS with our other scholars from both trade and the Latin American programs. It seems as though, to me, that the energy implications of NAFTA might be stronger between the U.S. and Mexico than with Canada. If we went back to the pre-NAFTA days, I suspect that the kind of traditional trading relationship between Canada and the United States would probably still hold. With Mexico, there are a lot of questions, certainly, that involve the reform process that has, energy reform process that's been underway in Mexico that's worth considering as part of the NAFTA discussions. So, other questions? In the back, please.
Brian Smith with WGL Energy. You mentioned deployment of solar and wind, sort of increasing your emissions-free generation in Canada, and with our country potentially looking at an infrastructure plan. I was wondering, is there any development of new hydro in Canada that will increase your renewable fleet?
Yeah, there are some large hydro developments included over the projection period. We are kind of a starting point for our electricity projections is to really look at what the individual provinces and the utilities there are planning. Electricity is very provincial in nature. Everyone kind of manages their own system. So we kind of key into what new facilities are on the radars for large hydro provinces. And there are some large ones. There's a big facility in St. John's, Newfoundland, Muskrat Falls, it's called. That's one of the bigger ones. Some large additions in Quebec, which already has quite a large fleet, and the other hydro provinces. Manitoba has Kiask, which is a large facility as well, and the Site C facility in British Columbia is also included. So there are some pretty significant increases, pretty much limited to the projects already kind of under the books or on the books, because hydro facilities, very large, kind of depend on where the resource is and lots of other issues. We kind of make a habit of sticking to the projects that are already planned.
One of the, to me, one of the very interesting things about hydroelectricity coming from Canada into the U.S., particularly into the northeast U.S., is that the phasing out of a couple of nuclear plants in the U.S. Northeast, difficulty in coal and maybe pulling back on that, and the inability so far to get a lot of pipelines built from the Marcellus up into New England certainly presents some challenges for electricity. And in the New England area that Canadian hydroelectricity is stepping into the balance to fulfill that demand. One of the things that EIA found, and I don't know about the specifics of New England, is that electricity demand growth in the U.S. has actually slowed quite a bit. So we're not getting quite the gains in electricity demand that we used to. A lot of that has to do with appliance saturation and so on. But that ability to have access to Canadian hydroelectricity has proved to be pretty valuable for U.S. consumers. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, Tom Tiernan with the Foster Report newsletter. On the oil and gas production, the Deep Panuke and Sable offshore production declines. I don't know if the EF 2017 was any different than the 2016, or if you have any comments on those production declines, if that's just subsumed by gains elsewhere, given the production forecast and the outlook.
But let me expand on that. Is the NEB forecast, I don't have the document in front of me, are there individual forecasts for specific fuels? So will you have a kind of a breakdown of how fuels are being consumed and that sort of thing? So how great is the breakdown of in fuel demand that you can look at in the NEB numbers?
So fuel demand, it's kind of by province, 5 sectors, and then power gen, and then several fuels within that. On the production side, it kind of varies depending on the resource. For natural gas, we do have it broken out by province, but as a whole, not specifically looking at Deep Panuke and Sable Island, but you can look at the Nova Scotia production trends. And I think they're similar to the previous outlook. They're definitely declining over the projection period. Do you remember?
I believe they hit 0 this time.
Yeah.
I don't remember if they do last time.
But it's so that's maybe part of that kind of near-term decline, but it is a relatively small number compared to some of the increases elsewhere. Much of the increases in the natural gas projection period are in the BC and Alberta, the tight gas there.
Right here, and then this gentleman next.
Hi, Justin Margolis, the Government of Quebec. And on your first slide with the methodology, you stated a number of constants. What, in your mind, is or opinion, is the biggest risk that's not factored in, either external or internal?
Would you say that again?
On the very first slide where you talk about how you define the 3 models that you did,
Right.
On the left or the right-hand corner, there was infrastructure will be built. Yeah. What are some risks that are not taken into account that you can think of?
Specifically for the infrastructure and the markets will be found. So our 2016 report kind of looked at both of those issues. For the crude oil side, we looked at a scenario which we called the constrained case that said, what if no new pipeline, or what if like some of the large Canadian export pipelines for crude oil were not built? So there were 4 major ones. If they don't go ahead, crude oil export capacity is limited to 4 million barrels per day. What we found is that, that kind of shifts some of the burden to rail. The amount that producers pay a higher cost then to get their product out, but they can still get it out through rail. So it's just really that higher cost goes back to producers. They produce a bit less. And it ended up being about 10% less based on that analysis. And then we looked at, for markets, we've kind of looked at LNG export scenarios. So we've done high ones, 0 LNG exports, that kind of thing. And it's a pretty significant factor for Canadian gas production, especially on BC. So those are some of the major ones that we're kind of thinking there is sort of pipelines and LNG exports.
In terms of ones we don't have on there, I'd say endogenous technology choice. We don't really have a thing that's sort of saying, hey, rank all these technologies using some sort of model. To pick the technology, we're picking the technology. That's probably a risk. We might be picking the wrong one.
There's a lot of talk. I mean, even though we go a bit further in our high carbon price and technology case, none of these are really like the crazy disruptive scenarios that some people talk about sometimes. I mean, or even something. I mean, like look at shale gas and what a big change that was in a relatively short period of time. So those type of changes could be very impactful for energy as well.
I can just, so I mean, these, the assumption about infrastructure will be built or markets will be found. If you look at our reports, it's been made since the beginning. And it made a lot of sense because whatever we produced in Canada and could not consume went to US. And there was a time prior to shale gas revolution that, if you looked at the Canadian forecasts or projections of natural gas exports into US versus what EIA was projecting, the numbers were very different. Canadians would offer 3 TCF, and the EIA forecast would need 6 TCF. So, I mean, the world has changed. We continue to make those assumptions for simplifying reasons, but we address, as Matthew said, on case by case, introducing that uncertainty in a different way, and keeping this report focused on its core, which is the demand and supply, and not get into the markets.
But one of the interesting things that I noticed last week when we had both the International Energy Agency here giving their World Energy Outlook, as well as the Institute for Energy Economics of Japan giving theirs, that one of the questions that came up in both sessions was I think it's a fair word, the failure of standard agency forecasts, and EIA had issues here as well in projecting renewables growth and the cost declines that were coming in solar and wind that were pretty difficult to factor into forecasts 5 and 10 years ago even. And I'm wondering how you struggled at the NEB to try to deal with rapidly declining costs associated with solar and wind in your longer-term forecast.
So yeah, I mean, any time you have big changes, it's kind of harder to factor them into the outlooks. We try to stick with, like I said, the utility kind of plans for solar and wind. Those kind of shifts sometimes and that kind of thing. We did try to kind of recreate, like it's beginning to be sort of a famous chart about the solar capacity, and here's the IA forecast, and every year they kind of see it plateauing and it never does. So we kind of tried to recreate that with our outlooks. Number one, it was hard because even 2011, 2013, we didn't even break out solar for Canada from like biomass or something like that. So that's number one, that there was quite a bit of a change. And I think back in 2011, it projected out to 2035. So that 2035 projection, I think we hit it in like 2014 or something like that. So, it's a pretty big change, but it's anytime you see big shifts. One of the changes, we showed our fossil fuel demand projections. One of the interesting things is you go back to 2007, we talk a lot about LNG imports into Canada in that scenario 10 years ago. So obviously that shifted 10 years later. We were doing LNG export scenarios. So another big change in a pretty short amount of time.
I know one of the other technology areas that EIA had a lot of thinking going into it, how to do it, was the technology, which is still changing in shale gas and shale oil development. So the costs there have been coming down too. So the idea that technology only applies to renewables is probably something that would mislead modelers if they made that assumption. So that's something to keep in mind too. I think we had a question here, and then we'll go back.
Hi, I'm Leonard Crook with ICF. My question is how do you factor in interregional flows of particularly natural gas in your forecast, and how does your assumptions there are affecting your general forecast as well as your regional, provincial forecasts?
So interprovincial flows of gas
interprovincial and international
in Canada, right? So gas going from Alberta to Ontario, for example.
Or from Pennsylvania to Ontario.
Yeah. So I'm going to say we don't really cover it explicitly. there's the hand wave with the infrastructure will be built thing. But I will say that we do use the gas pipeline competition model to sort of figure out what the differential in Alberta AECO is going to be to Henry Hub with this sort of forecast. So you sort of have that, discount factored in for the production side. And you do have a bit of guidance with the model to see what's flowing into Saskatchewan and, effectively Ontario, but just to sort of get a sense for our NGL models, like what's going to the straddle plants. So I think that half answers your question. But yeah, I don't think there's anything explicit in terms of the provincial demand with what you're asking.
But this is, I think, this is the next kind of a development area for us. So we do recognize that, we kind of leave it at a stage, like even for international, we leave it at X amount remaining for exports. Okay, that's how we have it in the report. So our next stage is basically to look at those flows. And you raise a good question about kind of focusing on that area.
I do recall that there were a couple of proposals for liquefied natural gas LNG facilities in the maritime provinces that would have relied on Marcellus gas. And I think that the economics of that looked a lot better when oil was over $100 than it does at current prices. But it's certainly something that if the global LNG markets continue to develop pretty strongly as they have been, it might be looked at again. Yes, sir.
I'm Reed Detchen with the United Nations Foundation. 2 questions, if you would. On the wind and solar chart, I was quite struck. You show relatively similar growth for both technologies. As an outside observer, I would think that Canada has a world-class wind resource and a, should we say, suboptimal solar resource. What's the constraint on wind growing faster than that? Are you simply relying on utility forecasts, which seems like a lagging indicator, or are you bringing these very low auction prices into consideration there? And then the second question is, on your oil price forecast, if you imagined a relatively steady price of 65 into the future, how would that ripple through your various forecasts? What would the implications of that be?
So let me see if I understand the second part. If oil prices rose rather than flattening out over the forecast?
No, they show it rising to 80. If it stays at 65.
Oh, if it stayed at 65,
and
the
then
lower oil price
and then
scenario.
you have
right.
the other
Okay.
scenarios even lower than that. What would happen then?
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of wind and solar, it's really kind of a function of the assumptions in the various scenarios. As I mentioned, the reference case was largely driven on kind of the utility plans and maybe longer term the economics. And in that one, wind, it doesn't. I mean, solar triples, but it's coming from a smaller base. The big growth area there is wind. In the technology case, you see a decent amount of wind being added as well, but a lot more solar, just because in that case, maybe there's a bigger downside on the solar costs. So in that case, solar capital costs decline a lot faster than wind, just based on the initial kind of assumption there. So that's why you tend to get so much solar in the long term. Based on the lower cost. I mean, the resource thing is an interesting area, and it's something to look further into as you sort of start doing more of these sort of kind of technology type scenarios. And then onto the oil one. So yeah, so if that kind of endpoint of the green line is $65, if that was kind of extended back to 2017 and we had a flat $65. The near-term production is probably fairly well set because it's largely based on kind of larger projects and that kind of thing. So I think you'd still see some of the near-term growth. Maybe long-term it would be dampened a bit. But at least for the oil sands, which is the major production area, especially in situ, what's called SAGD production, new facilities or even kind of like additions to existing facilities, our kind of view on supply costs there is it's between 50 and 60 dollars per barrel. So you probably would still see some growth at a $65 price.
Yeah, and I think in terms of fossil fuels, you'd probably still have the same peak or same year, but it's just a lower...
For the demand?
Demand fossil fuel use by the end of the projection period, just due to the oil production thing. You might have higher demand for a few fossil fuels just due to the lower price, that demand response over the prediction period, but I think the oil sands would really outweigh that.
There you go, mini scenario developed right there. So.
And actually, we've just released what we call EF supplements, and they are focused this time on supply side. So you can look at oil and gas production under various price scenarios. So that's something.
It might actually come out later this week, but it actually has a low price case
about,
that's a lot lower than that, like a $40 flat price case. So.
I only see two hands up, so let's take both questions, and if they're quick questions and quick answers, we can do that in the 5 minutes we have remaining. So.
Hi, Ben Proctor at the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center. My question's on, I think slide 11 that shows it, the coal production after 2030 and the phase out. Is that all carbon capture coal, or is there some other factors explaining production past the phase out? And then the other comment is, how much is the phase out actually causing the decline in coal production? There's some market forces here with the carbon tax at play as well that would induce early retirements anyway, but how much is the actually regulatory phase out contributing to the drop in coal production?
Okay.
Yeah, so there is a...
let's quick get this question here, and then we'll do it all at the same time.
Bob Eichord from the Atlantic Council. My question's on nuclear, and you mentioned nuclear's important role in Ontario. And it looked like from the circles that you're projecting that those will continue to operate through 2040, but I thought the policy was to try to phase them out sooner. And the other aspect of that, and so what are the assumptions there? And the other aspect of that is I know Candu Energy is working very closely with the Chinese to develop a new generation of Candu reactors. Are the utilities at all planning to consider that in terms of their future investments?
Okay, I have three questions. Status of coal after 2030, what's still being used, the carbon tax versus market forces, perhaps, in moving part of that first question. And then final question was the status of nuclear in Canada.
Okay, talking about coal. So the federal phase out of coal isn't actually a phase out everywhere. Nova Scotia and Saskatchewan have equivalency agreements. So if they reduce their emissions, an equivalent amount through other ways in electricity sector, is that what it's covered? And yeah, they could continue to burn coal. So yeah, there is some carbon capture and storage in Saskatchewan, but it's not all the coal is going to be carbon capture and storage. In terms of the market forces, yeah, like I sort of touched on that a bit. You have the earlier than required phase that's happening in Alberta in 2020. That's probably the biggest reason for the decrease, I'd say, right? Like the increased, the early phase out for the reasons you mentioned. And
it's kind of difficult to separate the specific regulatory phase out from some of the other policy initiatives and that kind of thing. There was an interesting research paper from a couple university professors in Canada, Brett Dolter and Nick Rivers. They kind of looked at this issue and found out that the coal phase out, they sort of looked at various carbon tax levels and for Canada's electricity mix and found that coal phase out basically happened around $60 or $70 per ton. So we might, if you sort of took away that phase out, we might, or all the phase outs, in our reference case, you might still see some coal generation, but maybe in our higher carbon price case, it would would kind of go away anyway.
I believe there's been other research too where a lot of the coal units in Alberta are just uneconomic at current electricity prices in Alberta. It's not necessarily a carbon, not solely due to that.
And on the nuclear question, for our nuclear projections, that's one that we stick to the utilities in Ontario. It would be kind of the ISO plan, and they have a long-term energy plan. So what's happening there is there's about 2,000 megawatts of nuclear that will be taken offline over the projection period, but a big chunk of it is being refurbished. So there's an entire refurbishment schedule. So actually, the projection of nuclear generation by year, it goes up and down quite a bit as a plant comes offline, refurbished, and brought back on. So that's really all that's happening with nuclear in Ontario over the projection period. Regarding some of the different ideas for nuclear, those are out there but not included in the projection, just basically the refurbishment as announced.
Well, I hope you would all join me in thanking the team from the National Energy Board in Canada, Ava Vargava, Chris Dolman, and Matthew Hansen. Thank you very much, all of you, and I really appreciate that. On behalf of the energy team at CSIS, thank you for being here and for tuning in, those of you on the webcast. Have a good day.